I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West.
So we're going to open up today with a challenging conversation, and we're going to talk about race and what it means in the psychological science of racial identity. And I think you can kind of hear the somber tone.
Yeah.
Right, Nikki? This is not like one of our more fun topics that we often can talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that because, well, obviously we want listeners to enjoy what we're saying. Really, the reason we did this podcast is we want people to learn something, have the opportunity to learn something, and hopefully everyone is able to use the current climate as an opportunity to learn more about racism in our society, white privilege, white supremacy, and Pete and I really wanted the opportunity to talk about that here.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to share. I think we're recording this a couple weeks after the murder of George Floyd, and we had done one episode. I think that's kind of helpful as we're trying to practice what it means to have a podcast.
Yeah.
I think we did a really good job with the content the first time we did this, and I think we're trying to do it again because we want to just make sure that we're capturing, the main essence of what racism is, the impacts of prejudice, and so we want to give it the space because education is key, and that's what we're doing here. And we're saying, and I think you and I have done a lot of trainings with people about diversity and inclusion, and I think these are really challenging things to talk about, and mostly because people don't talk about it.
That's right.
I mean,
even in psychology, that's the thing. Pete and I have been talking about this a lot. And we've talked about this before, frankly. Prior to the murder of George Floyd, prior to the protests, though it's been extremely top of mind, just the systemic racism that exists in our own field. If you haven't, looked at our website, Pete and I are both white, and the American Psychological Association, I think they estimate it's about 80% of psychologists are white, right?
Yeah, it's high. And then historically, like a lot of the theory and research is based on white males.
Yes, exactly.
And then thank goodness for girl power because people now it's a predominantly female field, but in terms of people of color and diversity, it's so
problematic, and so that of course impacts what we're talking about too. So we can't obviously discuss behavioral science without acknowledging the white supremacy that exists within that. And then actually also, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, that I can't remember if I was saying this to you, Pete, or not, but how Eastern spiritual traditions have come to the West has also been, really dominated by white voices,
Yeah. Well, and they suffered racism and persecution as they first came in. Some of the first Easterners to come into the West. I mean, in the Zen Buddhist traditions, one of the traditions of becoming a teacher is you light a candle and you drip the wax onto the document that your teacher gives to you to demonstrate the installation.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
And they do that because they had to do it in secrecy when they first came. So,
I didn't know that. Wow.
Right. So Buddhists, and again, Buddhism, traditionally speaking, is not even a religion, but the persecution. But here we are. Look, white people with our privilege. We just went to religion, and because race is so hard to talk about.
It's so hard to talk. Yes, and yeah, I mean, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about why it's uncomfortable. Let's talk about even how it's uncomfortable for you and I to discuss this here in like a public forum too, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll say it's less it's more comfortable for me.
That's true.
And I don't want
no, that's true. Well, and can I say, because Pete had some, and I don't. Well, let me start by saying this. I don't want to dog my training because I went to Pepperdine for my PsyD, and I would say Pepperdine, compared to most programs, I thought did like a pretty good job. That was definitely something that was a part of my training. And I was, my degree's in clinical psychology, and clinical psychology has not done nearly as skilled a job as counseling psychology, which is the degree that Pete has. And so Pete had just intensive training in talking about race in ways that I did not have.
Yeah, I mean, I had to spend an entire year just talking about race as a part of my practicum clinical training.
Yes.
So we used a couple of textbooks from Undoing Racism, Sean Utsi with, racial identity development, and looking at how, and me as a white person with a very diverse cohort could only talk about race. So if we were conceptualizing cases, or we were dealing with, something we were struggling with a client, we would only be able to talk about the racial constructs that were present in the room. And so,
So
plus I've done
important.
some of these other, Janet Helms,
Yes.
other sort of work around, racial identity. However, I'm still a white man, and so I think I'm a
Sure.
strong ally, and I feel like
Sure.
that's really where my comfort comes in.
Yes.
And I work in sport with a lot of athletes of color, and I
Yes.
really am so focused on empowering them to find their voice,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of systemic racism exists in sport and certainly in
Yes.
academia.
Absolutely.
Right. And so,
Absolutely.
so when we're talking about like privilege and power, so one of the things that will, and let me, so going back
Mm-hmm.
to the discomfort of race,
Yeah. Yeah.
the thing I often think about is when we had our first black president, it, no one talked about race when it was like him against John McCain. When Barack Obama was running
Mm-hmm.
against Hillary, you talked about gender. It was like the world's not ready for a black or a female president, and they could, right?
Yeah,
'Cause-
that was permissible in the conversation for
correct.
let me be, for white people. I would
Right.
say would be right that was
Yeah.
something that felt comfortable or accessible to discuss.
Right. And then that led to the Obama effect where, people of
Right.
color then felt like we got a black president. So like racism has been cured.
Right.
And frankly, I know in my lifetime, while I'm on this earth, I'll never see the cure of racism. I
No.
mean, it's just something that if we're just starting to talk about it because another black man was murdered, when are we
Well,
going to get, yeah.
well, that's what's so painful, and of course, again, I'm saying that as a white person who hasn't had to navigate oppressive systems my
Right.
entire life.
Right.
And I think that for a lot of white people right now, there is hopefully a little bit more of a waking up and understanding how pervasive this is. That,
Right.
because I thought for myself a lot, and I've talked about this with some other colleagues of mine, um, not all white, but colleagues that aren't non-Black colleagues,
Yeah.
that people that I work with, like Pete and myself, that we've prioritized, at least in psychology, and then of course that filters out into our experiences as humans. That this is something meaningful to us. That we try to think of things from a holistic, multicultural lens. That we want to
Yeah.
be good allies, and that's certainly something that, for myself, is very important to me and align with my values. And yet, the thing that had never quite stuck for me, and I've been hearing this echoing from not just colleagues, friends as well, that are not psychologists, it never quite resonated with me that part of privilege is that I have the option to turn it off.
That's
And I
right.
think that's the thing that hopefully, I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess I'll say, that
Yeah.
there's something a little bit different there and people noticing that. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Peggy McIntosh is a very,
Yeah.
famous, right,
Famous. Yeah.
unpacking the knapsack. And I think in psychology, like, I think most programs now read that. It was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was
Well,
like, at one
well,
point,
well, well, I don't even know if we want to tell this story, but Pete
uh,
and I had a
yeah,
very,
yeah,
d- you know,
we had a challenging
we had a
conversation.
challenging conversation. Well, we were have Pete and I had an aligned
Yeah.
perspective and had a challenging conversation with some
Colleagues that
colleagues of
hadn't done
ours.
the work. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
and so what
Yeah.
you and I did a good job with that was it's not like we were like angry at them. And I think, so one of the keys to these conversations is listening.
Yeah.
Because every time people have these conversations, and as you see riots, or it hurts my soul when I see these pictures of the groups, of the Democrats and the Republicans, the blacks, the whites, the white supremacists, and the allies,
Hmm.
because it's like an us versus them, and oftentimes that conversation is trying to convince the other person, convince,
Sure.
there's no such thing as systemic racism. Yes, there is. This is why. And I think the goal, at least for colleagues and educated white folk, is to listen,
Sure. Yes. Sure.
as
And
allies.
well, and I think, and I think part of that, agreed, 100%. Though another conversation I've been having with people recently, when with white people that I know, when they're saying, I want to listen, and yet people are so angry. I get they're angry, and when are we going to be able to talk about this? And
Yeah.
one thing that I've tried to emphasize and really practice myself is to acknowledge that the anger experienced by the Black community is beyond justified, right?
Yes.
That's beyond justified, and I think part of my opinion is part of our job, as if we want to be good I don't want to say good, effective white allies is in the listening space is
That's
to
right.
also make room for people to be angry.
Yes,
To
for
let them,
emotion.
for emotion, to let people have the space to express anger because, people are allowed to be angry.
Well, and there's the infusion of our Eastern practices is that,
Yeah.
creating the space for that emotion. We're not getting rid of
Yeah.
emotion.
No.
And I can't tell someone how to feel.
Well, and emotions serve a serve a function from a basic
Yes.
evolutionary perspective. Emotions give us information, and
That's
so
right.
they're telling us something. So what does anger do?
Mhm.
Anger, like the action urge, to get into dorky behavioral science here
Yeah.
for a moment, is what the emotion is telling you to do, and anger tells us to fight back
Yeah.
because either ourselves or someone we love has been harmed or is in danger of being harmed.
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of a better example if you're a member of a community that's experienced 400 years of
Oh.
oppression, violence.
Well, and even thinking about the Constitution, I think,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and I think, so on one hand, I think the forefathers, were super white, obviously, and
Hmm.
colonized. I mean, that's the
Yes.
other word you're hearing a lot of is a
Yeah.
colonization. And
Yeah.
in there, it says that Black people are 3/5 of a person. And so
Yeah.
if you don't think systemic racism exists, just read the Constitution.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I went to a protest in my neighborhood
Yeah.
that was led by the Black community there, and I live in a neighborhood that has experienced gentrification,
Yeah.
over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, and so this in the protest beforehand, there was a lot of speakers of people that had been in the neighborhood for a long time. And one of the things that one of the speakers had said that I thought was very excellent was that in talking about the Constitution and how this country was formed, he said, number one, the founding fathers didn't think that we were going to be here in reference to
To-
Black people.
Of course.
And number two, he said it wasn't written for anybody but
Right.
rich white men. And I
That's
think
right.
the rich is also important because it was for property owners. He said
That's
not for
right.
women, not for anybody.
Right.
And we don't we don't teach that very well in school,
No.
unfortunately.
No, and again, so here we are with race, where we talk about gender, we talk about
Yeah.
class. So if we go back to white privilege, this is another
Yeah.
term I think I don't use that term if I'm doing a diversity inclusion training, especially knowing my audience, because I think that's a very triggering word for some folks. And I think what I want to deconstructing that here is it's about the idea that me as a white person, I haven't had to look for things that look like me as role models.
Right.
I haven't worried about a book with somebody that looked like
Right.
me on the cover. And frankly, it's about access. I haven't had to
Yes.
worry about healthcare.
Mm-mm.
I haven't had to worry about too much crime on the
Well,
street.
or basic safety.
Basic safety.
Basic safety.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so those are all the, and in terms of privilege, so just being white, just being male,
Mm-hmm.
and also that, so I went to a very privileged high school, and my grandmother paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was access. Like, I had a
Mm-hmm.
grandmother who was able to pay for it.
Right.
So even though I had multi-generational aspects of my family, that was part of my privilege, that I had access to an education that set me up. And I think, in all of this, there's 4 CEOs of color in Fortune 500
Yeah, it's
companies.
something like that. I just
Yeah.
read some. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of them, like one of the gentlemen, and I don't remember his name, but he's from Philadelphia. And so he talked
Mm-hmm.
about how he got to where he got in this article I was reading. And he was saying that he was part of like an educational system of taking poor Black folks from,
Mm-hmm.
inner Philadelphia out to suburban Philadelphia to be educated. And that access is what led to him becoming a CEO. And and
Yeah.
that there it is. I mean, that's power and privilege. So even as a Black
Absolutely.
person, he represents and possesses some power and privilege at this point. So it's not
Yes.
just always about white and Black. There are other aspects of access within it.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's where have you ever read Hillbilly Elegy? Have you read that book?
No, no.
Great book. Vance, I think is his last name. And just as a kind of bizarre tie-in, I read that book a few years ago, and it came out right after I had read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, which are two
Oh,
excellent books. I
he's
highly recommend.
adorable too.
Yes,
Anyway,
yes, fabulous. And
adorable and smart.
yes.
Yeah.
And so what was very interesting about reading these two different memoirs, these different perspectives, Hillbilly Elegy is written by, I think he grew up in rural Ohio, I want to say. He's white, grew up in a very conservative family. the similarities between their experiences, of course, Trevor Noah growing up in South Africa under apartheid, right, was what the author of Hillbilly Elegy described as like systemic poverty.
Yes.
And so there were some similarities to their experiences.
Yeah.
And I think the thing we want to keep coming back to here in this conversation about race is that even a CEO, a Black CEO, he's still going to be at risk for being pulled over by the police.
Absolutely.
That in a way that, and I think that's, because I think what you're saying is really important, that we want to recognize, all of the, the intersectional factors.
It's multifaceted.
It's multifaceted, right?
Yeah.
And right now, where the conversation, is being spotlighted, I think very appropriately, beyond overdue here, is just recognizing that race itself is such a powerful influence in our society in ways that I think white people didn't really clue into.
No, and they still have it. And, even with Trevor Noah, and I joke and say he's he's beautiful and funny and smart, but I spent some time in South Africa, and with apartheid, that was a real significant event that was, I think, just like 50, 60 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, Nelson Mandela, and we've all just seen this in recent years, frankly. I think, but you still feel the racism there,
of course,
in a much more palpable way, in my opinion, in that you still have Black servants, today in the in this, and there's I think there it's, as we talk about intersectionality, multifaceted nature of this, I think there's I forget, like 30 or 40 country languages. Like I think there's
in South Africa,
there's 30 or 40 like national languages.
I'm not sure. I do know that there's a lot.
And so like that in of itself creates this hierarchy of like who speaks the better language, or it's sort of like English, UK, it's all these and that's the other thing that I think is important, is that there's intergroup racism that also kind of creates to this racial divide as well. Like, people within groups are typically more like based on, there's lots of research that shows skin tone within a group affects how people are respected within that same group.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I'm aware of, for example, like in India, that's often a topic. It's just interesting as we're talking, a thought that's floating around in my mind right now is that I can imagine some listeners hearing our conversation today thinking, isn't this supposed to be about psychology? Like, isn't this getting kind of political? And so I think I really want to make sure that I'm clear, and I'm going to speak for you gently here. I'm assuming you're aligned with this, because I know you and I share a very similar worldview, that Pete and I don't view this as political, that this is about humanity.
That's right.
I've been discussing that with students, asking like how to address this in therapy, and because as a psychologist, all therapists actually were trained not to impose a worldview on someone, which is really important because we want to practice from a non-judgmental place. And I would say that, racial justice, social justice, I think this is basic humanity. I mean, I can't view this with a political lens.
No, I think even today, so knowing that the Confederate flag is being taken down, it's sort of like, you hear there's a lot of people coming out of the woodworks, like people of color that have been in elected positions who have had to walk into a, elected office with the flag there. And, and it's, yes, it's our history. And the political thing would, if we get into like, should statues be there or not, we're not saying that. We're saying what's racial identity, what's white privilege, what's power, what's access.
What's power, and what's basic, what are behaviors that we can do that are aligned with basic human values? I mean, to use the flag example, I'm Jewish, not religious, but I don't know how I say culturally, yeah. And I think that some people with the flag didn't recognize that for a Black person to be in the presence of the Confederate flag would be no different than me walking in somewhere with a Nazi flag hanging there. Though I think that's not been clear to a lot of people. So anyway, I think that's just important to make sure we're saying that we're not here. It's not.
Thank you for that.
This is not a political podcast, and I want to make sure that people know that this is not.
Y'all be surprised when you hear what party I'm a part of. So anyway, we're not even. That's why this isn't political. But let's maybe as we end, let's think about. I love that you just said that, and thank you for that. And what are some maybe behavioral takeaways? So maybe if we think about maybe people wanting to listen to like hear about what could they do, maybe let's think of like 2 or 3 things that people can do as they leave.
I think that's
after
great.
listening to this. I'm going to suggest. Well, I haven't thought about this, so this is just other questions. Do you have a suggestion? Or
I do. I've got one right here. I've got one ready to go.
Go.
So I'm going to ask people, especially white listeners here, to make an intentional, mindful, conscious, willing choice to step into what's uncomfortable.
Good.
And really make space to get curious about that.
Get curious. I like that.
Yes. And do that for 2 reasons. One is the growth happens when things are uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. And number 2, it's going to give somebody a tiniest taste of what it might be like or feel like to be Black in this country, like to be uncomfortable, and just trying to take that and say, if I'm feeling uncomfortable like this, what might it be like to feel this way all the time?
Yeah, so that's good. So it's perspective taking, curiosity. I'm going to say ask open-ended questions and actually listen, but listen with open ears and find listening with an open heart.
Yes.
And I think that if we can just take that as our takeaways, we have this conversation in place to potentially start to make some change. And I think that's where, when I do this work, I often say, and one of my colleagues, Nancy Boyd Franklin at Rutgers, she says that hope is in the struggle. And that's a lesson that she had from her mom as a woman of color, one of the first Black psychologists in the US. And I'm going to say that I'm willing to share hope with our listeners, that, these actions could make some change. So Nikki, thank you so much for today. Your insights are always so welcome.
Vice versa. Hope is in the struggle.
Hope is in the struggle. This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.